New Year's Eve. When the clock strikes midnight, the world celebrates fresh beginnings. But for some, the night brings more than fireworks and resolutions. In this video, we unravel 3 bone-chilling New Year's Eve stories that will make you question what's lurking in the shadows of the most festive night of the year. From a mysterious stranger at a countdown party to an unsettling discovery after midnight, these tales will leave you speechless. Think you're ready to start the year with a shiver? Let's dive in. As the clock ticks closer to midnight on New Year's Eve, Emily Warren prepares for a quiet night alone in her apartment. But what starts as an ordinary evening quickly unravels into a heart-pounding nightmare. Cryptic phone calls, chilling messages, and an unsettling warning leave her questioning not just her safety, but who or what might be watching her. This is a story of suspense, isolation, and a New Year's Eve that Emily will never forget. Stay tuned as we unravel the events of this terrifying night. I never thought I'd spend New Year's Eve alone. For years, it had always been a grand event with friends, champagne, and fireworks, but this year was different. My friends were out of town, my family lived too far away, and after a long, grueling December, I convinced myself that staying in my cozy apartment with a bottle of wine and a good movie was all the celebration I needed. I didn't expect the night to turn into one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. The evening started off uneventfully. I cooked myself a small dinner, poured a generous glass of red wine, and queued up my favorite feel-good movie. Outside, the city buzzed with excitement. I could hear faint cheers and laughter from my neighbors as they prepared for the countdown. The energy was infectious, but I was content in my solitude, or at least, I thought I was. Around 9:30 p.m., my phone buzzed. At first, I assumed it was one of my friends wishing me a Happy New Year. But when I glanced at the screen, the caller ID was blank. Just a string of zeros. I hesitated for a moment, but decided to answer, thinking it might be some sort of glitch. "Hello," I said, my voice casual but curious. Silence. I waited a few seconds, repeating, "Hello? Who's there?" Still nothing. Just the faint sound of static on the other end. Assuming it was some sort of prank or wrong number, I shrugged it off and hung up. About 15 minutes later, my phone rang again. This time, the sound startled me. It wasn't the normal ringtone I'd set for calls, but a strange, high-pitched chime. My phone screen displayed the same string of zeros. A chill crept up my spine, but I answered anyway. "Hello," I repeated, now with a hint of irritation. "You're not alone," a voice whispered. It was faint, almost drowned out by the static, but clear enough to freeze me in place. "Excuse me? Who is this?" My heart raced as I sat up straighter, gripping the phone tightly. No response. The call ended abruptly, leaving me staring at my phone screen, my mind racing. A part of me wanted to believe it was some prank, maybe even one of my friends trying to mess with me. But something about the voice, its tone, its timing, made my skin crawl. I decided to shake it off. I muted my phone and went back to my movie, trying to immerse myself in the story. But the joy I felt earlier was gone. My mind kept wandering back to the call, replaying the voice in my head. "You're not alone." What did that mean? By 10:30 p.m., I convinced myself to stop overthinking. It was a prank, nothing more. I poured another glass of wine and leaned back into the couch. Just as I began to relax, there was a loud knock at my door. Startled, I jumped up, spilling a bit of wine on the coffee table. My first thought was that it might be one of my neighbors. Maybe they needed something, or perhaps they were inviting me to join their celebration. But when I looked through the peephole, the hallway outside was empty. "Hello," I called out cautiously, pressing my ear to the door. No response. After a moment of hesitation, I unlocked the door and opened it just a crack. The hallway was completely silent, bathed in the dull yellow glow of the overhead lights. I stepped out and glanced up and down the corridor. Nothing. No signs of anyone. My heart was pounding as I quickly stepped back inside and locked the door. It's just kids messing around, I muttered to myself, though I didn't entirely believe it. I tried to push the incident to the back of my mind, but every little noise in the apartment started to feel magnified. The hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the radiator, even the distant sound of fireworks popping outside made my nerves feel like they were stretched thin. Then, at 11:15 p.m., my phone lit up again. This time, there was no ringtone. The screen simply displayed an incoming call from the same number, 000-000-0000. My stomach twisted into a knot as I stared at it, debating whether to answer. Finally, I picked up. "Who is this?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Time's almost up," the voice said. It was clearer this time, with an unsettling calmness that sent shivers through me. Before I could respond, the call ended. I stood there for a moment, my hands trembling. My first instinct was to call the police, but what would I say? Someone was calling me from an untraceable number, saying cryptic things? It sounded ridiculous, even to me. Instead, I double-checked that all the windows and doors were locked. My apartment was on the 4th floor, and the building had decent security. Still, the unease gnawed at me. I turned off the lights in the living room, hoping the darkness would make me less visible to anyone outside. As the clock neared midnight, the air in the apartment felt heavier, charged with a strange tension. I'd muted my phone earlier, but now I turned it back on, hoping for some sense of normalcy. Instead, I saw a notification, one new voicemail. With shaking hands, I played the message. It was only a few seconds long, but enough to make my blood run cold. The same voice from before whispered, "Look behind you." I froze, my body paralyzed with fear. Slowly, I turned, half expecting to see someone standing there. But the room was empty. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst. I grabbed a kitchen knife and backed into the corner of the room, every sense on high alert. The fireworks outside began to explode, signaling the start of the new year. Cheers erupted in the distance, but inside my apartment, it felt like time had stopped. My phone buzzed again, this time with a text message. It read, "Happy New Year, Emily." My blood turned to ice. Whoever this was, they knew my name, they knew where I was, and they were watching. My hands were trembling so badly, I almost dropped the phone. The text stared back at me, unchanging. "Happy New Year, Emily." My mind raced. How could they know my name? How could they know I was here, alone in my apartment? I bolted to the kitchen window and peered through the blinds, scanning the street below. The usual New Year's chaos was in full swing. People cheering, fireworks bursting overhead, couples embracing. No one seemed out of place, no one looking up at my window, but the message had made one thing clear. Whoever this person was, they were close. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my heart hammering as I waited for the operator to pick up. 911, what's your emergency? "There's someone watching me," I said, my voice cracking. "They've been calling and texting me all night. They know my name? They just said," I paused, trying to steady my voice. "They just said, 'Happy New Year' in a text." "Ma'am, are you in immediate danger?" "I don't know. I think they're outside my apartment, or watching me somehow." The operator's calm tone didn't match the rising panic I felt. "Stay on the line. Police are on their way. Are all your doors and windows locked?" "Yes, I already checked." But my phone buzzed again, interrupting me. Another text. I glanced at it, and my breath caught in my throat. "You shouldn't have called them." "Oh my God," I whispered, backing away from the window. "They know I called you. How do they know I called you?" "Stay calm," the operator said. "Keep all the lights on and stay somewhere secure. Officers will be there in a few minutes." But I couldn't stay calm. My apartment felt like a trap. I kept imagining someone bursting through the door, or worse, someone already inside, waiting for me to let my guard down. I clutched the knife tighter, retreating to the bathroom, the only room with a lock. I shut the door, slid down to the cold tile floor, and braced myself against the tub. My phone buzzed again. Hiding won't help. Tears welled up in my eyes. This wasn't just some prank. This person knew exactly what I was doing. Minutes felt like hours as I sat there, holding my breath, straining to hear any sound from outside the bathroom. The occasional cheer or firework echoed from the street, but inside my apartment, the silence was suffocating. Finally, I heard a knock at the door. This time, it wasn't the eerie, unexplained knock from earlier. It was loud and authoritative. "Police, open up." Relief washed over me so quickly I nearly collapsed. I scrambled to my feet, unlocked the bathroom door, and rushed to the front door. I looked through the peephole and saw 2 uniformed officers standing there. "It's me. I'm here," I shouted as I fumbled with the lock. I threw open the door, tears streaming down my face. The officers stepped inside, their expressions professional but concerned. "Are you Emily Warren?" "Yes," I said, nodding furiously. "Someone's been calling me, texting me. They said they're watching me, that I shouldn't have called you. Please, you have to help me." One of the officers gently guided me to sit down on the couch while the other began sweeping the apartment. "We'll take a look around. Can you show us the messages?" I handed my phone to the officer, my hand still trembling. He scrolled through the texts, his brow furrowing. "Did you notice anyone outside tonight? Anyone unusual?" "No," I said, shaking my head. I looked out the window, but I didn't see anything. The second officer returned from checking the rest of the apartment. "No signs of forced entry," he said. "Everything looks secure." "What about the fire escape?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded. "I checked. No one there, but we'll stay here until you feel safe." The first officer handed me back my phone. "We'll file a report and try to trace the number. Unfortunately, calls from spoofed or untraceable numbers can be difficult to track, but we'll do everything we can." I nodded, feeling a mix of gratitude and lingering fear. They stayed with me for another hour, talking me through what to do if anything suspicious happened again. Eventually, they left, assuring me that patrol cars would be in the area all night. But even after they were gone, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I double-checked all the locks and finally crawled into bed, leaving every light in the apartment on. Sleep was impossible. At 3 a.m., just as I started to drift off, my phone buzzed one last time. My heart sank, and I almost didn't want to look, but I couldn't ignore it. I picked up the phone with trembling hands and stared at the screen. The message wasn't what I expected. "Check your kitchen." A cold wave of fear swept through me, but something deeper, a mix of anger and exhaustion, took over. I was done playing this game. Gripping the knife tightly, I made my way toward the kitchen, flipping on every light as I went. The room was empty, exactly as the officers had left it. And then I saw it. On the counter, where I'd left my wine bottle earlier, was something that hadn't been there before, a folded piece of paper. My breath caught as I approached it cautiously. With trembling hands, I opened it. The note read, "You've been warned. Be careful who you trust." I backed away, the words swimming in my head. My first instinct was to call the police again, but something stopped me. The note didn't make sense. It wasn't a treat, at least not directly. It felt more like a warning. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the living room with a knife in one hand and my phone in the other. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the sun finally rose, I called a locksmith to install extra locks and checked with building security to ensure no one suspicious had entered the premises. Days passed, then weeks, and the call stopped. The text messages never came again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been trying to tell me something. A warning, cryptic as it was, that I hadn't fully understood. I didn't know who they were or what they wanted, but one thing was certain. They were watching. And whoever they were, they knew something I didn't. To this day, I've never figured out who sent the messages or how they got into my apartment that night. But every New Year's Eve, as the clock approaches midnight, I can't help but wonder if they'll reach out again. So far, they haven't, but the fear never truly leaves. On a quiet New Year's Eve, a family gathers in a secluded farmhouse to welcome the new year, unaware that something far more unsettling awaits them. What begins as a nostalgic holiday retreat quickly takes a dark turn as strange and unexplainable events unravel a chilling mystery. The flickering lights, a cryptic word etched in frost, and an old photograph of an unknown woman all hint at secrets long buried. Was the house trying to tell them something, or warn them of something worse? Stay tuned as we dive into this gripping tale of suspense, family, and the haunting power of memory. I can still recall the sharp, biting cold of that New Year's Eve. My family and I had decided to celebrate at my grandparents' old farmhouse in Vermont. The house, nestled at the end of a winding dirt road, held a rustic charm that seemed perfect for a nostalgic holiday gathering. Despite its charm, I'd always thought the house felt tired, as if it carried the weight of too many memories. But I never imagined the events of that night would leave such an indelible mark on me. We arrived late in the afternoon, with the sun dipping behind the hills and casting long shadows across the snow-covered fields. My parents, my younger brother Danny, and I piled out of the car, our breath visible in the frosty air. My Uncle Greg and Aunt Marcy were already there, busy unpacking groceries and decorations. The plan was simple: a cozy dinner, some board games, and watching the ball drop on TV to ring in the new year. The farmhouse had been in the family for generations, and it showed. The floors creaked, the windows were drafty, and the old electrical system was notorious for its unreliability. Grandma always joked that the house had its quirks, but it had been empty for years since Grandpa passed. It felt strange being there again, like walking into a time capsule. As we carried our bags inside, I noticed how the light seemed to struggle against the dimness of the interior. The bulbs flickered faintly, a familiar issue that we all brushed off. "It's just the wiring," Uncle Greg said, tightening one of the loose bulbs. "This place was built before electricity was even a thing. Be glad the lights work at all." Dinner was a noisy, cheerful affair. Aunt Marcy's laugh echoed through the dining room as Danny tried to juggle a roll and failed miserably. Mom and Dad reminisced about their childhood visits to the farmhouse, painting vivid pictures of summers spent playing hide-and-seek in the barn and winters spent huddled by the fireplace. I found myself smiling, caught up in their nostalgia. After dinner, we cleared the table and settled in the living room. Uncle Greg built a roaring fire, and Aunt Marcy set up a board game on the coffee table. The TV sat in the corner, its screen reflecting the flickering flames. I sank into the old, worn couch, its cushions soft and familiar, and felt a rare sense of peace. That peace didn't last. It started with the lights. Around 8:30, just as I was about to win a round of the board game, the lights flickered once, then twice. "There it goes again," Dad muttered, shaking his head. "We'll be lucky if the power doesn't cut out altogether." The flickering stopped after a moment, and we carried on. But a half hour later, it happened again, this time more persistently. The lights dimmed and brightened in rapid succession, creating an almost strobe-like effect. Danny, always the joker, waved his arms dramatically and said, "Looks like the house is trying to send us a message." Uncle Greg chuckled. "If it is, it's probably just saying, get a better electrician." But the flickering continued. By 10 o'clock, it had become impossible to ignore. Every few minutes, the lights would dim and brighten, sometimes staying off for a second or two before sputtering back to life. Aunt Marcy suggested lighting some candles, just in case, and Dad retrieved a few flashlights from the car. "It's probably the wind messing with the power lines," Mom said, trying to reassure us. "Let's not let it ruin the evening." We tried to take her advice, but the flickering had a way of unsettling us. It wasn't just the inconsistency, it was the pattern. 3 long flickers, then 2 short ones, over and over again. Uncle Greg noticed it first and pointed it out. "It's almost like Morse code," he said with a nervous laugh. Danny, always eager for an adventure, pulled out his phone and looked up a Morse code chart. "It's spelling something," he said, his voice tinged with excitement. "3 longs and 2 shorts mean help." We all laughed nervously, brushing it off as coincidence. But as the clock ticked closer to midnight, the atmosphere in the house began to shift. The flickering grew more frequent, and the fire in the hearth seemed to dim in response, as if the house itself were reacting. Around 11:15, Aunt Marcy decided to check on the kitchen. She came back holding a framed photograph she'd found on the counter. "This is strange," she said, showing it to us. "Does anyone know who this is?" The photo was black and white, faded with age. It showed a young woman standing in front of the farmhouse, her expression serious, almost somber. None of us recognized her. "Maybe it was left behind when Grandma moved out," Dad suggested. "She always kept boxes of old photos around." Something about the woman's face unsettled me. She looked familiar, but I couldn't place her. Danny made a joke about her being an old-timey influencer before setting the photo on the mantel. The moment passed, but the unease lingered. By the time midnight arrived, we were all on edge. The flickering lights had become a constant presence, and the room felt colder, despite the fire. We gathered around the TV to watch the ball drop, counting down the final seconds of the year. 10, 9, 8, we chanted, our voices growing louder with each number. 3, 2, 1, Happy New Year. But the moment the clock struck midnight, the lights went out entirely. The fire in the hearth died down to embers, leaving us in near total darkness. Danny turned on one of the flashlights, its beam casting eerie shadows across the room. That's when we saw it. On the window pane, where the frost had melted slightly from the heat of the room, was a single word scrawled in the condensation. "Remember." For a moment, no one moved. We stared at the word, unsure of what to say or do. My dad broke the silence. "It must have been one of us," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe Danny messing around earlier?" Danny's flashlight beam wavered. "It wasn't me," he said. I didn't even go near the window." Aunt Marcy stepped closer, her breath fogging up the glass. "It's too neat," she said. "Too deliberate. I don't think a finger did that." Her words sent a shiver down my spine, though I tried to suppress it. "Maybe the condensation formed weirdly," I suggested, grasping for a logical explanation. "Or maybe it's from before we got here, and we just didn't notice." "Except it wasn't there earlier," Uncle Greg said, his usually calm voice tinged with unease. "I'd swear on it." None of us wanted to admit how unsettled we were. The warmth of the celebration had vanished, replaced by an unspoken tension. Mom suggested we call it a night, and we reluctantly agreed. Danny and I shared a room upstairs, the old twin bed separated by a wooden nightstand. The flickering lights had stopped, but the house felt heavier somehow, as if the air itself had thickened. I lay awake long after Danny's breathing had slowed, my eyes fixed on the ceiling. The word on the window played over and over in my mind. Remember. What were we supposed to remember? Or was it a warning? At some point, I drifted into a restless sleep, only to be jolted awake by a faint creaking sound. It came from the hallway, just outside our door. My heart pounded as I strained to listen, but the sound didn't repeat. Telling myself it was just the house settling, I closed my eyes and tried to calm my racing thoughts. But then Danny whispered, "Did you hear that?" My throat tightened, but I forced myself to answer. "It's just the house," I whispered back. "Go to sleep?" He didn't reply, and I assumed he'd fallen asleep again. But as I was about to drift back to sleep, I felt him shift in his bed. "I'm not joking," he whispered again, his voice trembling. "There's someone walking around out there." My stomach sank. I listened carefully, holding my breath, and then I heard it, a slow, deliberate creak like the weight of a footstep on the old wooden floor. It wasn't constant, just one step, then silence, and then another. Whoever, or whatever, was moving out there wasn't in a hurry. I sat up, my heart racing. "Stay here," I whispered to Danny, grabbing the flashlight from the nightstand. I didn't feel brave, but I had to do something. With a deep breath, I tiptoed to the door and cracked it open. The hallway was pitch dark except for the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the far window. "Hello," I called softly, my voice barely above a whisper. The house answered with silence. I stepped into the hallway, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. The air felt colder out here, as if the warmth of the fireplace hadn't reached this part of the house. The flashlight beam wavered slightly as I scanned the hallway, stopping at the staircase. That's when I noticed something strange. The framed photo of the woman from earlier was now lying on the floor at the base of the stairs, face down. My pulse quickened. Had someone knocked it over? Or had it fallen on its own? I crept down the stairs, each step feeling like an eternity. When I reached the photo, I hesitated before picking it up. The glass was cracked. I stared at the photo for a moment, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The young woman's face seemed different now. Her expression was no longer somber, but almost pleading. I shuddered and set the photo back on the table near the stairs, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. As I turned to head back upstairs, I froze. The word from the window, "Remember," was now faintly written on the mirror above the mantel, the letters jagged and uneven, as though scratched by something sharp. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't heard anyone come downstairs. How could this have happened? "Mom? Dad?" I called out, louder this time. My voice echoed through the empty house, but no one answered. I backed away from the mantel, the flashlight shaking in my hand. My foot bumped against something on the floor, and I looked down to see one of the candles Aunt Marcy had lit earlier. It was extinguished but still warm to the touch. That's when I noticed a faint trail in the dust on the floor, footprints leading from the living room toward the kitchen. Against every instinct telling me to wake the others, I followed the trail. The kitchen was darker than the rest of the house, the windows covered by heavy curtains. I shone the flashlight across the room, my eyes darting to every shadow. The footprint stopped abruptly near the back door, which was slightly ajar. I swallowed hard and stepped closer. The cold night air seeped through the opening, and for a moment, I considered closing it and running back upstairs. But something compelled me to look outside. I pushed the door open wider and stepped onto the porch. The snow-covered yard was undisturbed except for a single set of footprints leading away from the house and into the woods. They were too small to be an adult's, but too large to belong to Danny. My hands trembled as I shone the flashlight toward the tree line, but the beam didn't reach far enough to see anything. "Is someone out there?" I called, my voice cracking. The words felt weak against the vast silence of the night. I waited, but there was no response. The only sound was the faint rustle of the wind through the trees. I turned back toward the house, deciding I'd had enough. But as I reached for the door, I noticed something scratched into the wood near the handle. Not safe. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. Without thinking, I slammed the door shut and locked it, the sound echoing through the empty kitchen. I ran upstairs, bursting into my parents' room. "Mom, Dad, wake up!" I shouted, shaking them awake. "What's wrong?" Dad mumbled, sitting up groggily. "There's someone outside," I said, my voice shaking. "And something's not right. There's writing on the mirror and the door." Before I could finish, the lights flickered back on. The sudden brightness was almost blinding, and for a moment, everything felt normal again. Dad got up, rubbing his eyes. "Let's check it out," he said, trying to calm me down. But when we went back downstairs, the writing on the mirror was gone. The door was locked, and the scratches near the handle were no longer there. Even the footprints in the snow had vanished, leaving the yard pristine and undisturbed. "It was here," I insisted, my voice rising. "I swear it was here." Dad put a hand on my shoulder. "It's late," he said gently. "Maybe you were half asleep and imagined it." But I knew what I'd seen, And as I looked back at the mantel, I noticed the photo of the woman was gone. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. My family brushes it off as a mix of faulty wiring and an overactive imagination. But every New Year's Eve, I think about the farmhouse, the flickering lights, and that single word, remember. And I wonder if I missed something I was supposed to remember but never did. Six friends, one remote cabin. What was meant to be a quiet New Year's retreat turned into a night of growing paranoia for Ryan Caldwell. Strange visions, an unexplainable presence at the tree line, and a chilling video recording left everyone questioning reality. What did Ryan really see that night? And why was he the only one who could see it? Stick around as this suspenseful story unravels, inching closer to a haunting revelation you won't forget. I was at a secluded New Year's cabin with my girlfriend and two other couples, ready to unplug and celebrate away from the city. The air was crisp, and the stars felt closer than they ever did back in Portland. We'd planned this getaway for months, a retreat from our buzzing phones and endless notifications. The cabin sat deep in the woods, isolated enough to make us feel like we'd left the world behind, but comfortable enough with its modern amenities. A wood-burning stove kept the chill at bay, and the porch offered a view of towering pines that stretched as far as the eye could see. Around 11 p.m., as the laughter and clinking glasses filled the small living room, I excused myself to grab more firewood. The shed was a short walk from the cabin, just beyond the porch. As I stepped outside, the cold hit me harder than I expected. My boots crunched on the frost-coated ground, and my breath fogged the air. I reached the shed, grabbed an armful of logs, and turned back toward the cabin. That's when I saw it. At the edge of the tree line, where the porch light barely reached, a figure stood perfectly still. They were too far away to make out any features, but their stance was unnerving, rigid and unyielding, as though they were carved from stone. They faced the cabin, not moving, not even shifting under the cold. My heart began to pound in my chest. "Hey," I called out, my voice shaky but loud enough to carry through the stillness. No response. The figure didn't flinch. I swallowed hard and took a cautious step forward, the firewood digging into my arms. "Do you need help? You're on private property." Still nothing. My pulse quickened, and a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. After a moment that felt like an eternity, I forced myself to turn away and head back inside. My hands trembled as I opened the door, and I nearly dropped the logs. My girlfriend, Emily, noticed immediately. "Ryan, are you okay?" she asked, setting her glass down and coming toward me, her brow furrowed in concern. "There's someone out there," I said, nodding toward the window. "At the tree line." The room fell silent. Mark, one of the guys, stood up and walked over to the window. He peered out, squinting into the darkness. "I don't see anything," he said after a moment. "They were just there," I insisted, my voice rising slightly, standing completely still, watching the cabin. Emily placed a hand on my arm, her touch warm and grounding. Maybe it was a shadow or something. The light can play tricks out here. I shook my head. "No, it was a person. I'm sure of it." The others exchanged uneasy glances, but no one pressed the issue. We tried to move on, resuming our celebrations, but my mind kept drifting back to the figure. Every so often, I'd glance out the window, half expecting to see them again. And then I did. It was closer this time, just beyond the porch. The figure stood in the same rigid pose, only now I could see more details. They were tall, their face obscured by shadows, and they were pointing, one arm outstretched, finger aimed toward the woods. I froze, my glass slipping from my hand and shattering on the floor. Everyone turned to look at me, their faces a mix of confusion and alarm. "They're back," I whispered, pointing toward the window. "Look." Mark and Emily rushed over, followed by the others. But as they pressed their faces to the glass, their reactions puzzled me. "Ryan, there's no one there," Emily said gently, her tone laced with concern. "What are you talking about?" I snapped. "They're right there. Don't you see them?" "Maybe you should sit down," Mark suggested, his voice calm but firm. "You've been drinking, and it's late. The woods can mess with your head if you stare too long." Frustration bubbled inside me. I knew what I saw. The figure was there, as clear as day. But arguing wouldn't help, so I nodded reluctantly and sat back down. My mind, however, was far from at ease. As the night wore on, the figure appeared again and again, always closer, always pointing. Each time, I was the only one who could see them. The others began to look at me differently, worried, skeptical. I felt trapped, unable to convince them of what I knew to be true. By midnight, the tension in the cabin was palpable. The celebratory mood had evaporated, replaced by an uneasy silence. When the clock struck 12, we half-heartedly toasted to the new year, the clinking of glasses hollow and forced. That's when I made my decision. I couldn't ignore the figure any longer. I had to know who, or what, they were. As the others huddled around the fireplace, I grabbed my coat and headed for the door. "Ryan, where are you going?" Emily called after me, her voice tinged with panic. "I need to see," I replied, my hand on the doorknob. "I can't just sit here anymore." "No," she said firmly, rushing over to block my path. "You're not going out there. It's not safe." The others joined her, forming a barrier between me and the door. They pleaded with me, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of concern. Eventually, their persistence wore me down, and I reluctantly agreed to stay inside. But the unease lingered, gnawing at me like a festering wound. The hours stretched on, and sleep evaded me. I lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling while the others dozed in their rooms. The cabin was silent except for the occasional creak of the wood and the faint rustle of the wind outside. My thoughts swirled endlessly, replaying the images of the figure over and over. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, waiting. At some point in the early hours of the morning, I heard something, soft, deliberate footsteps on the porch. My body tensed, and my heart thundered in my chest. I sat up slowly, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped, and the silence that followed was deafening. Against my better judgment, I got up and crept toward the window. Peeking through the curtains, I scanned the porch and the tree line beyond. Nothing, just the faint light of the moon casting long shadows over the frost-covered ground. But as I turned to head back to the couch, I caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye. My breath hitched as I turned back to the window. The figure was there again, standing in the same spot near the tree line. Only this time, they were closer than ever, just a few feet from the edge of the porch. My stomach churned as I realized they weren't pointing anymore. Their arm hung at their side, and their head was tilted slightly, as though they were watching me, waiting. I stumbled back from the window, my pulse racing. For a brief moment, I considered waking the others, but a deep, unshakable fear rooted me in place. I didn't want to look like a fool again. Instead, I retreated to the couch and sat there, trembling, until the first rays of dawn began to creep through the windows. The next morning, as the pale light of dawn seeped through the curtains, we stepped onto the porch to find my phone lying on the wooden planks. The screen was cracked, and the battery was nearly dead. When we played back the last video recording, my blood ran cold. The footage showed me walking into the woods alone. There was no figure, no one pointing the way. Just me, mumbling to myself, my face pale and expressionless. The video ended abruptly, leaving us all in stunned silence. And when we checked the security camera footage from the cabin, the story was the same. The figure I had seen so vividly wasn't there. Only me, standing on the porch, staring into the darkness as though speaking to someone unseen. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. But one thing is certain, I'll never set foot in those woods again.